Funky Politics.
Funky Politics Show.
Funky Politics.
Funky Politics.
Funky Politics.
Funky Politics. Powered by MLGW. Memphis Like Gas and Water.
Keeping it real, right, and funky. Funky Politics.
Politics.
You know I need some money, gotta get the money, cause I need some cash in hand. Come on, gotta get it. You know I need the money, gotta get the money, cause I need some cash in hand. Come on, gotta get it.
You're listening to Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm DC, one of the wonderful hosts of this program, sitting along with Doc Ward, Lee Eric Smith here, and also the beautiful Roshan Austin. Doc, what's up with you?
Man, you really need to stop doing it, man.
I need, putting you on the spot?
Make everybody's beautiful. It's not just one person.
Well, I mean,
everybody's beautiful.
But she is beautiful.
Okay, but everybody's. We know she is.
Well, you're not.
But you sound chauvinist when you
Oh,
just refer.
is that chauvinist?
Yeah.
Okay, well.
Yeah, you know, there is a Me Too movement going on here.
Well, there's also a Be Best movement going on, too, but we hadn't claimed that one, have we?
Well, be your best you can possibly be.
Whatever. I can't stand you on some days.
Just
Let's
be
talk
your
about being our best right now.
Okay.
Michael Cohen
Yeah.
has proven
That's
that
not being your best.
Well, he's proven he can make a lot of money, though.
Michael Cohen gives a C law student, makes a C law student look bad.
Wow.
Okay, but I will say this though. You know the situation with him and Novartis, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So they pay him $100,000 a month or so to go back to the president and give them some feedback on the administration's policy on health care. $100,000. After about a month or two, they realize this man doesn't know the difference between a stethoscope and a thermometer. So all of a sudden, they get rid of it. But they keep paying him the $100,000 for the entire year. So for $1.2 million, he's giving them absolutely nothing. So he may not know law, but he knows hustling.
Hey, he gave him unfettered access.
The art of the deal.
But speaking of the art of the deal, we've got a young lady here visiting with all of us today.
Yeah.
Miss Nikki Jackson, the Senior Vice President and Regional Executive with the Fed. That's right, folks. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Louisville Branch out of Louisville, Kentucky.
And she's going to talk to us about a number of things.
That's right.
You know, economics.
Yep.
Boubonomics.
Empowerment of our people.
Through Boubonomics.
Through Boubonomics, that's right.
And you're going to find out what that means if you just hang on with us for a little while. And she's going to tell you how you can get that mean green for the things you like to do right here on Funky Politics.
Powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Keeping it real, right, and funky. It's Funky Politics on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
We're getting funky, y'all.
33% of Americans have a college degree. 43% of Africans in this country have a college degree. These are African immigrants that are coming into this country. They didn't have the opportunity and access, but they came over here in this American dream and created within this framework the opportunity that this country was set up, the ideal it was set on. And now to say that these people, because the disparaging remark goes further than just hole.
It's Funky Politics on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN. It starts with you. Plus one.
You know, giving back through Plus One will make a difference for families in crisis.
It starts with you. Plus one. Grandma's message couldn't have been any clearer. If you want to change Memphis, look in the mirror. It starts with you. Plus one.
I remember when we got help from Plus One.
And now we're helping others.
Hey, Memphis, you can make a change.
You too can make a difference.
Artivism.
Artivism features conversations with artists, creatives, and citizens working at the intersection of art and social activism. And I'm Linda Steele, your host. I'm a grant maker, change maker, social venture capitalist, and I invest in individuals and projects that use the arts as a vehicle for social change.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN.
Politics is what we do. We just make it funky.
You're listening to Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm DC, one of your hosts here of this show, along with Doc Ward, Roshan Austin sitting in with us, and also Lee Eric Smith. And we're visiting today with, I tell you, a great placemaker out of Louisville. That is Miss Nikki Jackson, the Senior Vice President and Regional Executive of the Fed Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Welcome to Funky Politics, Ms. Jackson.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Wow. It's great having you here. Let's talk a little bit about the Nikki Jackson, how you got here in this space that you're in right now with the Fed out of Louisville.
So I actually started out my career practicing law in Florida. Then I spent a great deal of time in human resources, and then moved into this role. Happened upon it via a contact in LinkedIn. Shout out to LinkedIn.
Shout out.
And yeah, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. It's something that I never would have thought I would have been a part of. And I don't hail from the banking or the economic sector, but here I am, and I'm really enjoying every minute of it.
Yep. And since you've been there, have you had a chance to develop somewhat of an agenda or platform of what you want to do and what you want to accomplish while you're in that position?
I have a couple things. So my job is kind of likened to a PR role, sort of, in that my job is to help the community understand the Fed and help the Fed understand the community. So I'm just trying to reach out to a larger community. I have four focus areas. One is higher ed. Another is minority community, Black and brown people. Women is my third, and then finally the folks that are going to be moving into the C-suites in the years to come. So that's the heir apparent. Maybe they're in manager or director level roles now, but not necessarily in the C-suite level, but will be. So those are the four groups that I'm working on targeting.
Hey, Nikki, this is Lee Eric Smith. All I can remember when I hear people talk about the Fed, when I would hear it on the news, whether it's Alan Greenspan, Bernanke, whoever, is they're talking about the Fed. The rates are going to be going up. The rates are going to be going down. Other than that, for the most part, the Fed is very, very mysterious. Can you draw a line between what the Fed does and, let's just say, what happens in, quote, the hood? Why do people who...
Did he say the hood?
I said the quote unquote the hood.
The quote hood, okay. It's not the real hood, just the quote hood.
It's near the hood. But if can you kind of just break down in very, very simple, straightforward language, like why the guy on the corner or the guy who runs the shop on the corner cares about what happens with the Fed? Okay, I'm happy to do it. Let me just say what I should have said at the outset real quick, though, that when I'm talking today, I'm speaking on my behalf and not necessarily the Federal Reserve. So what I say is attributable to Nikki Jackson and not the St. Louis Fed. So why should folks in community work to understand the work of the Fed? Well, I guess if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to flip the premise, because I think that the Federal Reserve is a public institution, public organization. We make monetary policy, meaning we influence long-term interest rates that then influences short-term interest rates. And I don't know anybody among us that's not accountable or responsive or impacted by that work. So it's not so much, part of it is why should folks everywhere care about the Fed, but the other part I think is why should the Fed care about greater folks at large, a larger community. And to me, that because we're public, we have a responsibility to be intentional in reaching out to folks in quote unquote the hood, and to being visible on in Black and brown communities and low and moderate income communities, and talking about issues and topics that are important to them, to us, including community development, economic education, fair lending practices, Community Reinvestment Act stuff. So that's all important because we're all impacted by that, and especially the folks who've been kind of historically not a part of economic decision making.
You're listening to Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
So just to expound on that further, I did foreclosure prevention work, for instance, for 9 years. And I found that when I talked about rate and I asked people what did they know about their rate, they usually didn't know, but they were interested more in the payment. And working in the affordable housing business today among people who are 80% and below the median, that's still the same instance. They're looking at payment versus rate, and it's because they don't really understand how rates impact them negatively and keep them in poverty and never get them to have any wealth. So I guess I like to discuss that more. How do we? And I'm always interested in translation. And so when I'm talking to people as a community development practitioner, I may use an anecdote and say, if I loan you $1, I'm expecting $1.50 back. And people are like, why would you expect $1.50 back? And so I use real simple terms to get them to understand. But I find that that's whether it's a person that's 80% or below the median or a person that's middle income. And even some of the wealthier customers I dealt with doing foreclosure prevention did not understand the impact of rate on their payment and their ability to gain wealth. And that really was more of a statement than a question, but I just like to discuss it more.
Yeah, I'm happy to react to it. So, well, I mean, you all know as well as I do that where we learn these principles about wealth building and about what the impact of a rate is oftentimes is either in our homes or in our circles of influence. And for a lot of folks that hail from low and moderate income communities, the conversations never come up because we just don't have anything. I mean, there's no reason to really have a discussion about wealth building because you're just trying to survive. And the interest rate, I mean, clearly, I mean, you just give me the bottom line. What is the payment? I need to know if I can afford it or if I can't. And so dissecting how money works, it is absolutely about pulling the veil back and trying to illuminate the intricacies of these practices and policies, because we need that. I mean, we need that. Black and brown people, we just haven't had it. And low and moderate, not just black and brown, but of course low and moderate. I mean, you got folks in Appalachia and Kentucky and Mississippi, Tennessee. They haven't had it either. So it's just really a matter of exposure and being intentional and having those conversations where folks are meeting folks where they are.
Well, we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about a little bit of funk and finances, talking a little bit about the plight of African Americans and how we make it in the middle class here. Right here on Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
We're getting funky, y'all.
The Memphis Park with the Jefferson Davis statue was put up in 1964 during the Civil Rights Movement. These were all symbols of an oppression. These statues need to be in a historical context. They need to be in a museum, a Civil War memorial site, maybe even be at the ancestral home. All these things are valid places, but a public place of prominence was not where they needed to be.
It's Funky Politics on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN! Ladies, uncomplicate your life. A Step Ahead Foundation offers free birth control to all women, no matter the need. Rich, poor, young, old, insured, uninsured, it doesn't matter. They'll even help you get to the doctor. Take control of your life. Visit getfreebirthcontrol.org today.
The KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN!
Funky Politics.
Don't believe me, just watch. Don't believe me, just watch.
We're back with our special funky financial guest, Miss Nikki Jackson, Senior Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Louisville Branch. And we're talking a little bit about finances, the Fed, and funk, three things that we definitely know a lot about at this table. But as it relates to African Americans, because that's one thing that we've been delving into as part of, you said your plight as the Senior Vice President was reaching out to people of color, black, brown people, people that have been economically disadvantaged historically and have not had the benefit of the literacy and education about money that is ordinarily there with their counterparts. What do you see as, in part of your platform, the plight of African Americans moving forward financially in terms of what you can do and what you're trying to do during your tenure at the Fed?
Okay, two things let me say real quick. First is I've never been called a funky guest, so I'm still like in that moment.
God. That's a compliment. That's a compliment.
That was incredible.
That's a compliment. There you go. All
We're
right.
glad you like
there
the
you
phone,
go.
Baba.
There you go.
A funky guest. I love it. God, I need to get like a sign or something for my office.
Yeah, unfunky guests are not welcome here.
Right. Right, and then again, I just want to reiterate for your audience that I am speaking on my own behalf and not necessarily for the Federal Reserve system as a whole. Or
Speaking funkily on your own. We got you.
Yeah,
there you
funkily
go.
on my own.
All right.
So for black and brown communities, it matters to me that I am in this role, sitting in this role as a black female, and there's a lens that I bring to this work that is, unapologetic and fairly undaunted in the responsibility that I have in reaching people who look like me from a gender and race standpoint. And part of that drive is because I'm fully aware of the absence of these kinds of conversations in our homes and in our communities. So I'm trying to be really intentional in bringing them. So yeah, I mean, it's just there are a lot of realities that when we look at communities that have been beleaguered and intentionally disinvested from and intentionally disinvested in, that I think we need to look at from a remedial standpoint. And again, that's Nikki talking, not the Fed.
Sure.
But what helps in thinking about remedy from a policy standpoint is data, and data from a compelling organization that has credibility, that is apolitical, that is, doesn't have any skin in the game necessarily. But I'm so proud of the work that we've done, especially in St. Louis, in the community development area, and especially in the Center for Household Financial Stability, because we're hitting these issues square on about wealth building gaps and race.
Now I was going to ask you a question. I don't mean to cut you off, because you just said something about the Center for Household Financial Stability. And my question was going to be, how do you get into the living rooms of the disadvantaged to actually give your message? So is your Center for Household Financial Stability the vehicle which you use to do that?
Well, they're not going into living rooms, but I tell you.
Well, I mean, figuratively.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But the data that they promulgate, the research studies that they promulgate, absolutely is appropriate to be discussed in living rooms. So how we do it is stuff like this. I mean, this is why I'm so happy to be a part of this radio show, and these kinds of conversations matter, and being in the news, both written and broadcast, matters. And so I know that our economists in that area are pretty well sought after in media outlets. So just trying to get the word out there, and then lots of convenings. I mean, I can't understate the importance of our bringing together folks from a multitude of communities to have dialogue around these issues. And I'm really intentional about doing those in communities of color, bringing our economists who are thought leaders in this area to those communities for purposes of these conversations.
You're listening to Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Hi, Nikki. This is Lee Eric Smith again. You mentioned data and some of the data that the Fed is able to collect. Have you run across any surprising data relative to, black and brown people that, something that might either be counterintuitive, people might not expect, or, what a nugget of data that might mean, the come up for people of color?
I guess it depends on who you mean, to whom it would be surprising. So for me, no. I think, so we have this great data set, this great publication series called The Demographics of Wealth, shameless plug, that I would encourage you to check out on stlouisfed.org under our community development arm. And there's a series of white papers that have been promulgated in this space that kind of reaffirm what I think most progressive black, brown folks understand, which is a lot of our wealth gaps and the reasons behind our generational poverty realities are less about educational attainment and our inability, quote unquote, inability to save money and invest money in our financial acumen, and more about the realities of racism in our country. And so that's not to diminish the important role of education and financial literacy and, owning property and life. That is all very, very important. But there's this other component that is equally as daunting, and that is our access to credit, our access to good jobs, our access to financial consulting that's healthy, and what we see in our neighborhoods by way of healthy banking options and so forth. So all of that is real, and that's just what we try to help bring to communities, to help illuminate for folks in their living rooms, as it were.
So one of the things I like to talk about, and this is Rashawn, of course, the other woman on the phone.
I think she just took a shot at us. Whatever.
When you say Rashawn, the other woman. No, it's not. This is Rashawn.
Very often, and not specific to the Fed, but just to kind of talk largely about policy. One of the things that, and it's a I don't know what's the term I want to use, it's a myth that 3 decades later or more, after a strong push for homeownership among African Americans with the 100% loan, 100 plus LTV loan, the stated income loan, and then we had the crisis. And among not just community development practitioners, but among middle class and upper middle class African Americans, homeownership has been such a huge push. And I understand the historical context from which it's coming after slavery and sharecropping. But what I've come to realize is that it's not a way necessarily for us to create wealth. And so I wanted to kind of discuss, it's one way, but what we find is that people are upside down during the crisis and they don't really have any net worth. And so just kind of want to discuss that. We always go back to home ownership, but what other vehicles are there for wealth building among African American and Latino populations, and even Asian, so black and brown people in the United States outside of home ownership?
Yeah. I'm going to encourage you and your listeners to check out this publication. It's called the State of Black Louisville. I submitted via, in my capacity, I submitted a article talking about this very issue. And it was generally related to Louisville, but certainly illustrative, I think, of the realities of our entire country. So, home ownership is important, but to your point, it is a way, but not the way, and it's all contextualized. So, home ownership where, at what interest rate, at what level of growth, in what kind of neighborhood. So, all of that kind of matters. I don't think we do a good enough job. We mean the folks throughout the country who are advising people to buy homes. I don't think we do a good enough job at explaining all the contextual pieces around home ownership. So there's certain manners in which that makes sense, and some that it just doesn't. There's no secret that being able to save and invest is probably one of the more fail-safe ways of wealth building. And it's harder for black and brown, I believe. It's harder for us because those just aren't conversations or rooting that we've had historically. Education is important because education begets arguably higher level roles with higher level pay, but we also know that there's still some issues with pay equity across our country, so we have to think about that. So there's almost always a footnote. Again, this is Nikki talking about the Fed, but there's always seems to be a footnote with regard to traditional wealth building platforms and processes that apply to black and brown people because of where we've come from.
Well, I'll tell you what, make sure. We're talking to Nikki Jackson, the Senior Vice President and Regional Executive for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis out in the Louisville Branch. But make sure to check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn app, or your favorite podcast provider. You know what? We'll be right back with you to talk about a little bit of Boubonomics on Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Uptown, funk you up. Uptown, funk you up. Uptown, funk you up. Uptown, funk you up.
Funky Politics.
It starts with you.
I remember when we got help from Plus One.
And now we're helping others.
Hey, Memphis, you can make a change.
Riffin' on jazz.
This next gentleman we're talking about has an unforgettable voice.
My sugar is so refined.
Jazz was the happiest. Now, Calloway went to my school.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's not an alum because he didn't graduate. He had some gigs to do.
Riffin' on jazz on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
This is Dr. Elisa Haushalter, and you're listening to Funky Politics on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Mississippi putting it down. I'm the hottest round. I told y'all can't stop me now. Listen to me now. I'm lasting 20 rounds.
We're back with Funky Politics right here on the KUDZUKIAN Network. DC, Doc Ward, Rashawn, and Lyric sitting in with us. And we are visiting with, man, I tell you, we are talking to a young lady out of Louisville, Kentucky, Miss Nikki Jackson, the Senior Vice President and Regional Executive for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Louisville Branch. Hey, how you doing, Nikki?
I'm great. Loving this conversation.
You know what? Let's talk a little bit about Boubonomics. And, you know, a lot of people don't know what Boubonomics is. Let me give them a little education on Whiskeynomics in Tennessee. No. You know, Kentucky is rich. Bourbon-nomics. Whiskey. Sorry. I got the wrong nomics. It's Bourbon-nomics. And one thing about Kentucky, they are rich with corporations. I think Brown and Furman, a few others who is Brown and Furman in Kentucky? Brown and Foreman.
Yeah,
I've had too much bourbon, so it's Brown and Foreman, not Furman. But anyway, and what it brings to the economy there in the state of Kentucky, as well as the Louisville area, and to the African American community. Can we talk a little bit about that? How does Boubonomics work for us in Louisville?
Well, first, let me tell you how much I appreciate you using that term, Boubonomics, because I think we just made that up one day. I don't know where it actually came from.
At the Fed, or did you make it up?
I think we just made it.
Wow.
Our mayor refers to it as Bourbonism, but we call it Boubonomics. I don't know why. But yeah, as you probably know, you and your listeners probably know that, bourbon is Kentucky is the birthplace of bourbon. And we produce about 95% of the world's supply.
Wow.
We're proud to affirm that bourbon is America's only native spirit, and to hail from the state that this native spirit for the country comes from is particularly pride-inducing. So it's a big deal for us here in our region, in the zone that I'm responsible for. It's a signature industry responsible for about $8.5 million.
That's a lot of money.
But I think the thing that you're missing, though, and I don't want to step on your Kentucky toes, is that in order for bourbon to be called bourbon, it pretty much has to be made in Kentucky. It can't be made anywhere else.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Right.
Because bourbon is a native spirit of the United States, and it was declared as such by Congress, and therefore the only place that bourbon can be made is in Kentucky. Nowhere else.
So this stuff I'm making in the backyard is not bourbon?
No.
Okay, I thought I'd ask.
That's called rock good.
That's called lighter fluid if you're making it.
What do you guys say about it? Go ahead, Lyric. What are you talking about over there?
Question. But I was wondering, because, a lot of people's interaction with bourbon happens at the package store, particularly in communities of color. But my question would be, how can African Americans and people of color get in on Bourbonomics at the higher level? In other words, where we're not just consumers of it.
Level?
Where we're not just consumers of it, but we're maybe making money off of it.
Actually, I like that level.
Is that door open anywhere? And do I have to move to Kentucky to do it?
Well, you may have to move to Kentucky to do it, but you don't have to sound so upset about it. I mean, there's all kinds of great stuff happening. We have there's about 18,000 jobs.
Wow. 18,000?
18,000 across the state that are specific to the bourbon industry. And you know what? So when you think about bourbon, especially here in Kentucky, so of course there's lots of distributor opportunities, I would imagine, elsewhere outside of Kentucky. But what I can tell you within Kentucky is that there are production opportunities, there are tourism opportunities, there are
plenty of drinking opportunities too.
What's that?
Plenty of drinking opportunities too, by the way. Do they have test takers? Like drinking test takers?
For professional test takers.
Yeah,
I think we all like to think that we are professional test takers. So there's about over 30 distilleries in Kentucky, but
Wow.
I mean it's responsible for so much of our tourism dollars because you've got urban trails, urban bourbon trails,
Right.
and then of course the production side, and then the sales side and the distributing side. So all of that is rooted, not exclusively so, but primarily so in Kentucky. So there's lots of opportunities to get plugged in.
Are there any statistics, though, because we understand it's a cottage industry to Kentucky, as to how much of the industry is controlled by non-African Americans versus African Americans, and compared to how much of the product is consumed by African Americans versus non-African Americans? Is there any statistical data on that?
Probably, but I just don't know them. I mean, I off the top of my head, very much anecdotally, what I would presume, based on nothing but Nikki's presumption, is we've got some work to do in assuring greater presence with minorities, African Americans, people of color in this industry, especially as compared to our consumption rate. But there are, I mean, I'm seeing a couple. I can think of maybe 2 or 3 off the top of my head here in Louisville, minority-owned bourbon production companies that are doing really well.
Wow.
I was going to ask that question. Were there any of the companies minority owned? And do you know the percentage of the 18,000 jobs that are held by people of color?
I don't know off the top of my head, but yeah, there are a couple of minority owned. Not many. I'm only thinking of 2. There could be more than that, but just the 2 that I know. That's all I can kind of recall at this moment. But I wish I did know that statistic. But I'm hopeful that it's on par with what availability would suggest. But I'm happy to look into that.
Well, backing that up, then, how does the Fed affect Boubonomics? Or how can the Fed, at least from your standpoint, affect Boubonomics as a successful, diverse industry in Louisville? Since we've already established that the only place you can make bourbon is in Kentucky. How can you, what are some things that you all can do from a financial standpoint?
Well, nothing from a financial standpoint because it's outside of our role. So we're not a financier. We don't make grant making. We don't bestow money on any. That's outside of our purview.
But you all can drink a lot of liquor.
Power. Going back to our convening power, one of the things that I'm proud of that we did when I first started a couple of years ago is we held a large forum. We call it our regional economic forum. We had a large forum where we featured members of the Kentucky Distillers Association and had them come in and talk about the impact of Boubonomics across the region. And, we had a really diverse audience.
And they brought samples.
We didn't bring samples. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. So
that's a pretty good time.
Yeah.
Well, Nikki, I got a question for you, Nikki, and that's when I like to have my bourbon. It's about 8 to 8:30. But anyway, with respect to...
In the morning?
No, that's right, morning. But with respect to, I think you said there's a bourbon trail or something there. But I understand there's several institutions in the I guess the Louisville area. Well, I know one particular. How is the partnership, or is there, because you came out of higher education, is there a strong partnership with that, with those Kentucky distillers in, I think it's Kentucky State there in Frankfort, is that right? Yeah. Do you know of, as a former higher ed administrator, that if there is a strong, a strong umbilical cord to that industry versus those young people at the school?
Are you talking about Kentucky State University?
Yes, that's correct.
Umbilical cord, man.
Well, yeah, I mean,
like a whiskey umbilical cord.
Wow, I wasn't thinking it that way. But something that feeds. Are they allowing Kentucky State to feed those students?
Does the bourbon flow over to?
Yeah.
Oh wow. I mean, well, you got to be careful with the age, appropriate age limits. You got to be 21, so not all college students are 21. So I think a lot of our distilleries, a lot of the folks in this, in the spirits industry are very careful about outreach on college campuses because they don't want to be irresponsible. But I would say overall, I mean, I'm hoping that this answers your question on some level. Overall, our signature industries in Kentucky, I think they do a really good job at reaching out to undergraduate students for purposes of pipeline building, internships, and for jobs. I wouldn't say that that's limited to the bourbon industry. You may not see that with the healthcare folks. I see that with their manufacturing folks. I see that with our logistics presence, the people who establish our logistics presence here.
Yeah.
So I think overall they do a really good job in reaching out to our folks in higher ed, and that's not that's certainly including the folks at Kentucky State and Simmons College of Kentucky, which is our other HBCU.
Wow. You know what, we've enjoyed having you on Funky Politics here. Miss Nikki Jackson, Senior VP of the St. Louis Fed, located right there in Louisville, Kentucky. Am I not right, Doc Ward?
Yep. And she's the purveyor of all things Boubonomics.
Boubonomics. Thank you so much for visiting with us today. You're right here. Come on back and see us again. Would you, Miss Jackson? Would you please do that for us?
I'd love to. Thank you so much.
You're listening to Funky Politics, powered by the KUDZUKIAN Network.
We're getting funky, y'all.
And we have to thank Dick Durbin for being strong enough to actually come out of the Oval Office and say, hey, by the way.
Because he didn't have to say it, did he?
He didn't have to say it,
and I appreciate it.
Because I tell people all the time, just because you skin folk don't mean you kin folk.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Just because you skin folk, you ain't got to be kin folk.
It's Funky Politics on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
KUDZUKIAN.
If you want to change Memphis, look in the mirror. It starts with you. +1.
I remember when we got help from +1.
And now we're helping others.
Hey, Memphis, you can make a change.
You too can make a difference.
Funky Politics, we are the voice in your ear with the words that we hope lead you to action, accountability, activism, and ultimately achievement. We got a lot to share, but you got to be willing to listen. You've got to be willing to learn, and we've got to be willing to give it to you every week the realest, rightest, funkiest way we know how. So today we talked about money and what we need to do to not just to attain wealth, but to empower our communities. The first step is the basics. And we talked about the basics today. We did. Food, clothing, and shelter. But first thing, food. And how food affects the ability for people to eat and eat healthy affects everything else.
So talk about self-determination also.
And self-determination. So whether you want to go out and grow a garden or you want to go out and solve an issue relating to food deserts or not, those are just parallels. It's really all about the self-determination to continue through whatever struggle life gives you to elevate yourself and others to a point of achievement. And to be honest with you, that's what we've always been about, and that's what we'll always continue to be about. So, we want to thank our co-host and our co-guest today.
That's right.
Lee Eric Smith, Rashawn Austin, for bringing us some funky information. And we definitely want to thank our guest. I definitely want to thank our guest from the Federal Reserve,
Nikki Jackson.
Miss Nikki Jackson,
yes, sir,
who gave us a lot of information. And so they gave it to us so we can give it to you.
That's right.
And that's what we will always continue to do. So until next time or next week, whenever that will be, we're going to continue to do our thing, and we implore you to do the same. And you know what the thing is?
That's right.
To keep it real,
keep it right,
and always keep it funky. Right here on Funky Politics.
On the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Funky Politics executive producer Larry Robinson for KUDZUKIAN. Hosted by Daryl D.C. Catron and Marcus M.D. Ward. Guest bookings by Miko. Funky Politics recorded at KUDZUKIAN Studio. Directed, produced, recorded, and distributed by KUDZUKIAN.